What if I told you that one of the most famous self-made billionaires in history didn't actually build an empire, but instead inherited a massive fortune and spent decades losing it? Imagine receiving $500 million in today's money and managing to lose so much of it that you were essentially living on a series of high-stakes bailouts. This is the story of a man who didn't win because of his business genius, but because he was a master of the illusion of success. Today, we are tearing down the gold-plated facade of Donald Trump's financial history as we dive into the explosive new book, Lucky Loser. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, we're exploring Lucky Loser, how Donald Trump squandered his father's fortune and created the illusion of success by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters Russ Buettner and Suzanne Craig. This isn't just a political book, it is a meticulous, forensic autopsy of a myth. Whether you've followed his career for decades or only know him from the headlines, what we're going to discuss today will change how you look at the concept of the American dream. By the end of this episode, we'll understand the staggering amount of money Fred Trump funneled to his son, the reality behind those early Atlantic City failures, and how a reality TV show managed to resurrect a dying brand. Let's start with the foundation, the origin story. For decades, Donald Trump told us he was a self-made man who started with a small loan of $1 million from his father. But the data tells a completely different story. Russ Buettner and Suzanne Craig spent years digging through over 100,000 pages of tax returns and financial records. What they found wasn't a small loan, it was a fire hose of cash. Imagine being 3 years old and already earning what would be $200,000 a year in today's money from your father's empire. By the time Donald graduated college, he had received the equivalent of millions. Fred Trump wasn't just a father, he was a silent, massive financial engine that never stopped running. He didn't just give his son a head start, he built the track, bought the car, and paid for the pit crew. But here's the fascinating part of the lucky loser narrative. The more money Donald was given, the faster he seemed to burn through it. He moved from the steady, reliable world of outer borough apartment rentals, Fred's bread and butter, into the flashy, high-risk world of Manhattan skyscrapers and Atlantic City casinos. He wasn't looking for steady returns, he was looking for the grand slam. Think about the sheer scale of the waste. In the 1980s, while the rest of the country saw him as the king of the deal, his actual businesses were hemorrhaging cash. He bought a football team, the New Jersey Generals, and helped sink the entire league. He bought an airline, the Trump Shuttle, which never made a dime of profit. He bought the Plaza Hotel for a record price and couldn't even cover the interest payments on the debt. The book reveals a staggering statistic. In several years during the late 80s and early 90s, Donald Trump lost more money than almost any other individual taxpayer in the entire United States. He wasn't just losing, he was losing at a professional level. Now, you might be wondering, if he was losing so much, how did he stay afloat? This is where the lucky part of the title comes in. It was a combination of Fred Trump's constant bailouts, sometimes literally sending a lawyer to a casino to buy $3 million in chips just to give the house cash, and a banking system that decided he was too big to fail. So the banks had lent him so much money that if they called in the debts, they would go down with him. So they gave him an allowance. The king of the deal was essentially on a monthly stipend from his creditors. Before we move into the era of the casinos and the ultimate reinvention, let's take a quick breather. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden world of high-stakes finance, do us a huge favor. Share this episode with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us keep the lights on and the stories coming. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when we get to the Atlantic City years. Let's talk about Atlantic City. This was supposed to be the jewel in the crown. Donald entered the casino world with the same bravado he brought to everything else. He built the Taj Mahal, the eighth wonder of the world. But behind the gold leaf and the neon lights, the math simply didn't work. He had financed the project with high-interest junk bonds. To even break even, the casino would have had to perform at levels never before seen in the history of gambling. He was essentially gambling with the house's money, but the house was built on a foundation of sand. When the Taj Mahal went into bankruptcy just a year after opening, it wasn't a fluke, it was the mathematical certainty of his business style. Over-leverage, over-promise, and then use the legal system to walk away while others, contractors, small business owners, and bondholders, took the hit. One of the most revealing parts of the book is how Donald treated the people who actually built his dreams. The authors document how he would routinely refuse to pay full price to carpenters, plumbers, and glass installers, forcing them to accept cents on the dollar or spend years in court. It's a pattern of shifting the cost of his failures onto the shoulders of the working class. But even as the physical buildings were failing, the brand was being born. This is the ultimate illusion. Donald realized early on that he didn't need to be a successful businessman if he could convince the world he played one on TV. He became a tabloid fixture, a caricature of wealth. He understood that in America, fame is often mistaken for competence. By the late 90s, Donald Trump was in serious trouble. Fred Trump had passed away, and the inheritance, while massive, was being depleted. The banks were tired of him. He was becoming a punchline. And then a man named Mark Burnett entered the picture with a concept for a reality show called The Apprentice. This is the turning point of the book. The Apprentice didn't just document his success, it manufactured it. The producers took a crumbling office in Trump Tower, built a fancy set, and edited the footage to make a man who was struggling for cash look like the ultimate arbiter of corporate power. They turned a lucky loser into a global icon.
By the early 2000s, Donald Trump's financial life was a disaster. He was basically living off a series of loans and the remains of his father's estate. But then came The Apprentice. If you want to understand how the illusion of success became a reality for millions of people, you have to look at what happened in those editing rooms. The producers of the show described Trump Tower at the time as shabby. The carpets were frayed, the furniture was dated, and the offices were half empty. But on television, everything was gold-plated and high stakes. They created a version of Donald Trump that was the ultimate commander of the boardroom. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a total rebranding. And the most incredible part? It worked so well that Donald Trump started making more money playing a successful businessman than he ever did being one. Between his salary for the show and the licensing deals that followed, Trump brought in hundreds of millions of dollars. For the first time in his life, he had a massive stream of cash that didn't come from his father or a bank loan. It came from his image. He started putting his name on everything: steaks, vodka, travel sites, even a university. But the book Lucky Loser highlights a dark side to this licensing era. Because he wasn't building the projects himself, he was just selling his name, he didn't care as much about the quality or the ethics of the people he was partnering with. This led to a string of failed international projects in places like Panama, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. In many cases, everyday people lost their life savings investing in Trump buildings that were never finished or were mired in corruption. To Donald, it didn't matter. He got his licensing fee up front. He was the lucky loser once again, walking away with a check while everyone else held the bag. One of the most eye-opening chapters in the book deals with the opportunity cost of Donald's career. The authors do a fascinating bit of math. They look at the roughly $413 million in today's dollars that Donald received from his father over his lifetime. They then ask, what if he had simply taken that money and put it into a boring, low-cost S&P 500 index fund? The answer is staggering. If Donald Trump had done absolutely nothing, if he had never bought a casino, never started an airline, never touched a single building, and just let his father's money sit in the stock market, he would be worth billions more today than he actually is. His decades of deal-making didn't build wealth, they actually shrank the potential of the fortune he was given. It's the ultimate irony. The man who wrote The Art of the Deal would have been much, much richer if he had never made a single deal in his life. But why does this matter so much? It matters because the illusion became a political platform. The authors argue that the myth of the brilliant, self-made billionaire was the primary credential that propelled him to the White House. People believed that if he could do for the country what he did for his business, everyone would be rich. But the reality, as documented in these tax returns, was that his business was a house of cards kept upright by a reality TV producer and a massive inheritance. Now, before we get to the final takeaway and the cheat sheet for this book, I want to address the why. Why did Fred Trump keep bailing him out? The book paints a touching, if somewhat tragic, picture of a father who couldn't admit his favorite son was failing. Fred had built a rock-solid business based on frugality and government-backed housing. He saw Donald as the star who would take the Trump name to the big leagues of Manhattan. To admit Donald was losing money was to admit Fred's own legacy was at risk. So the money kept flowing, even when it made no economic sense. Let's take one last quick second. If you're finding this forensic look at a financial empire as gripping as I am, please make sure you've hit that follow button. We dive into the world's most influential books every week, and your support is what allows us to keep digging into the truth behind the headlines. As we wrap up this deep dive into Lucky Loser, what is the ultimate lesson for us in 2026? First, it's a lesson about the power of narrative. In the modern world, your brand can be more valuable than your actual bank account. If you tell a story loudly enough and long enough, people will eventually treat it as the truth, regardless of the data. Second, it's a cautionary tale about transparency. For years, the public only saw what Donald Trump wanted them to see. It took decades of legal battles and investigative journalism to uncover the actual tax records. It reminds us that we should always look behind the curtain, especially when the curtain is made of 24-karat gold. Third, it redefines our understanding of success. Is a winner someone who inherits $500 million and ends up with less than they started with? Or is the winner the person who starts with nothing and builds a stable life? The book forces us to question who we idolize and why. To wrap things up, here is your Lucky Loser cheat sheet. First, follow the money, not the name. The Trump empire was built on a foundation of Fred Trump's cash, not Donald's deals. Second, beware of junk bond brilliance. High leverage and high risk strategies often look like genius during a boom, but they almost always lead to a crash where the little guy gets hurt. Third, image is a product. The Apprentice was a marketing masterpiece that sold a fictional character to the world, and that character eventually became more powerful than the man himself. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Exploring the reality behind the myth is never easy, but it's the only way we can truly understand the world we live in. If this episode gave you a new perspective, share it with someone who appreciates a good reality check. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep checking the math, and remember, the loudest person in the room is often the one with the most to hide. See you in the next episode.